Marcel Khalifa here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report from Gaza. We turn now to Iran. Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iraq Sunday for a historic meeting of the Iraqi leaders, first visit to Iraq by an Iranian president since the Iran-Iraq conflict of the 80s. At a news conference with the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki in Baghdad, Ahmadinejad said his visit would open a new era in Iraq-Iran ties. He also rejected U.S. allegations his government is interfering in Iraq's affairs.
We want to tell Mr. Bush that accusing others will increase the problems of America in the region and will not solve them. The Americans have to accept the region as it is. The Iraqi people do not like America.
Earlier, Ahmadinejad had made light of U.S. allegations, saying, quote, "Is it not funny that those 160,000 forces in Iraq accuse us of interference?" While Ahmadinejad's visit could be a pivotal moment in improving Iran-Iraq ties, it's also seen as a sign of the dwindling drumbeat for war coming from Washington. It's been nearly 3 months since the release of a national intelligence estimate concluding Iran had shut down its nuclear weapons program years ago. The report was a major blow to Bush administration efforts to shore up support for possible military strike in Iran. Stephen Kinzer is the author of All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror. The book chronicles the CIA-backed 1953 overthrow of Iran's democratically elected government after Iran nationalized its oil industry. The aftershocks of the coup are still being felt. His book has just come out in paperback, and he's traveling the country to warn against a U.S. attack on Iran. I sat down with him to talk about what is happening today in Iran.
It's more possible than you'd like to think. In a reality-based, fact-based policy environment in Washington, you'd think that the idea of attacking Iran would be off the agenda now. Not only is there no enthusiasm in the military for this, or even in the Defense Department civilian side, we're very stretched in Iraq, obviously, and there doesn't seem to be any public demand or urgency for it. In addition, we had this national intelligence estimate, which undercut what had been the principal argument for an attack, which was Iran is just about to develop a nuclear weapon, and therefore we need a preemptive attack. Now, our 16 intelligence agencies have issued this report saying, actually, no, they're not developing a nuclear weapon, nor have they been working on this project for at least 5 years. So that also, you would think, would eliminate this possibility. Unfortunately, though, I think first of all, the fact that the possibility is fading a little bit off the public agenda, and public opinion is being kind of anesthetized to this possibility, increases the danger because there doesn't seem to be any public outcry or any outcry in Congress. Secondly, I think the national intelligence estimate might have perversely made the attack more likely in one sense. Before that estimate came out, the U.S.'s policy was going to be, now we're going to get the Security Council and the European Union to agree to really tight sanctions on Iran because they're about to develop a nuclear weapon. And we thought we were going to be able to do that because it was that urgent. But now, the reason why we said those sanctions were so urgent has been undercut by our own intelligence agencies. So the sanctions option is more or less off the table. They're not going to agree to sanctions now. And I think that might lead people in the White House to think, well, sanctions option isn't there anymore. I guess bombing is the only option. Here's the nightmare argument that I could imagine being made inside the Oval Office. We had to suffer 9/11 because wimpy Clinton did not go over there and take care of that threat while it was gathering. There's a threat gathering in Iran. It could be even more serious with millions killed in a nuclear bomb attack on the West. The next president won't be able to carry out this drastic action for political reasons, but obeying the call of history, we're going to realize we got to take care of this threat before it grows out of hand. I fear that some variation of this argument, particularly as the election approaches later this year, could lead us into a crazy adventure that's not only going to set back the cause of democracy in Iran by a generation, strengthen the regime that we profess to detest, eliminate the entirely pro-American sentiment that now exists among the population of Iran, probably set off retaliation attacks by Iran on Israel and maybe states in the Persian Gulf, possibly result in the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran could do by just sinking a couple of tankers, and that's 20% of the world's oil right there. Undoubtedly trigger a huge explosion of anti-American violence in Iraq, probably also in Afghanistan. It would further destabilize Pakistan, which is already in upheaval, and I think throughout the Muslim world you see great upheaval. So you can foresee all these negative effects, but based on what we now know about the long-term effects of the last time we intervened in 1953, I think I could predict one thing. Despite all those negative effects we could predict, history suggests that the worst long-term effects of this operation would be ones that nobody can now imagine. That's the lesson we learned from the aftermath of 1953, and that's why that story of 1953 is now so relevant again as we're preparing possibly for another attack.
Well, before we talk about the effects now, like specifically why you think it would reinforce the hardline conservatives in Iran, let's go back to 1953, something that's not very much done on television in the United States, taking a look at history or context. What did happen? Why is it that the people of Iran, this is indelibly written for every child who certainly wasn't born then, but in the United States, they don't know what you're talking about?
I'll tell you an interesting story to start off. I was recently on a panel in the National Cathedral in Washington, and one of the other panelists, we were talking about Iran, was Bruce Langan, who had been the chief American diplomat in Iran and was the most prominent figure among the hostages that were held there for 444 days. I knew that Langan had become an advocate of reconciliation with Iran, which I considered quite remarkable, considering the ordeal that he suffered. So I wanted to talk to him. I hadn't met him before, and we exchanged some emails after that. He told me an amazing story. He said, I had been sitting in my solitary cell as a hostage for about a year when one day the cell door opens and there is standing one of the hostage takers, one of my jailers. And all of my rage and my fury built up over 1 year sitting in that cell just burst out, and I started screaming at him. And I was telling him, you have no right to do this. This is cruel. This is inhumane. These people have done nothing. This is a violation of every law of God and man. You cannot take innocent people hostage. He said, I went on like this for several minutes. When I was finally out of breath, the hostage taker paused for a moment, and then he leaned into my cell and said in very good English, you have no right to complain because you took our whole country hostage in 1953. That story really reinforced to me the connection and the fact that those hostage takers took those hostages not out of nihilistic rage, but for a very specific reason that seemed to make very good sense to them. In 1953, the Iranian people had chased the Shah out, but CIA agents working inside the American embassy in Tehran organized a coup and brought him back. So flash forward to 1979. People of Iran have chased the Shah out again. He has been admitted into the United States.
Under Carter.
Under President Carter. And
ostensibly for medical reasons.
People in Iran are thinking, it's all happening again. CIA agents working in the basement of the American embassy are going to organize a coup, and they're going to bring the Shah back. We have to prevent 1953 from happening again. That was the motivation for the hostage-taking, although I don't think any of us really understood that at the time.
Stay there in 1953. It was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt. Explain what happened.
What happened was that in the first half of the 20th century, Americans had a super good image in Iran. The only Americans there were doctors and school teachers and people who really were selflessly devoting themselves to Iranians. Meanwhile, the British and the Russians and the French and other colonial powers were ripping Iran apart and stealing and looting everything of value there. So people in Iran had a very high, exalted opinion of the United States. The perfect country, the ideal country. And the words of Franklin Roosevelt in all his radio speeches during the Second World War also had a big impact on Iranians. And of course, there was a big World War II conference in Tehran that just focused Iranians on the ideals of freedom that the Allied powers said they were fighting for. So in the period after World War II, Iranian nationalism came to focus on one great cause. At the beginning of the 20th century, as a result of a corrupt deal with the old dying monarchy, one British company, owned mainly by the British government, had taken control of the entire Iranian oil industry. This one company had the exclusive rights to extract, refine, ship and sell Iranian oil. And they paid Iran a very tiny amount, but essentially the entire Iranian oil resource was owned by a company based in England and owned mainly by the British government.
Called British Petroleum?
That was Anglo-Iranian Petroleum, later to become British Petroleum and BP. I'm still on my one-man boycott. I go to the Shell station as if Shell is somehow morally